everyone for joining us for another Cyber Skyline Live. I'm Franz Payer with Cyber Skyline, and I'm here to help you learn about cybersecurity. We run these episodes for you, so please stick to the end and let us know what topics you want us to cover in the future. With today, this week's topic is Coding Basics number 2. If you have missed it, we previously did a Coding Basics number 1. There is a video on YouTube if you search for the Coding Basics 1 with Cyber Skyline Live. That'll show up and you should be able to go and watch that and recap it. But this is going to be the second episode. So if you need a little bit more context, go and watch that before diving into this video. I'm going to jump into my slides, and I ask you all, please let us know any questions you have as we walk through today's show. We'll start answering them as we get to breakpoints. But I'm going to jump into my slides. And the very first thing that you are going to want to do is make sure that you install Node.js. So today we're going to be using Node.js. Node.js is it's a JavaScript engine which allows you to run JavaScript code. And so if you don't have this installed, you can install it on Kali Linux or other Linux systems pretty easily. The reason why you want to install Node.js when we didn't have to do that last episode is because Node.js allows you to actually do input and output with files on your machine. You can't do that with Chrome. You need to use Node.js to do that. So take a moment right now to install it if you haven't already. And we'll get to a demo at the end. You can follow along, and I'm just going to run through the code, some code samples as we go through today. But if you want to actually go and try this stuff out, definitely get that installed first. Now, once you get Node.js installed, you're going to write a program and you're going to save it. And you want to save that program as a .js file. You can name it whatever you would like. And when you're ready to run the program, you just simply type in node space and then the name of the file that you want to run. So if we're creating a program and we're calling it myprogram.js, when I want to run it, I'm going to type in node myprogram.js. I'm going to hit enter, and then it's going to run all of my code. If there are any errors, I'm going to see at that point in time. But that's how you start executing these programs, is just by typing the name of the program with node. All right, so let's talk about loops. That's our first topic for today. From a high level, loops are just a set of instructions that just keep getting executed until a condition is reached. This is very helpful if you want to perform repetitive tasks. As an example, sometimes you might want to loop through a list of items, and maybe you perform a task on every single item in that list. Maybe you want to print out the item, maybe you want to save it to save some text to disk. Sometimes you might specifically want to perform an operation a certain number of times. This is a great way for you to actually be able to repeatedly call some code and have it execute. There are 3 different types of loops. You've got while loops, for loops, and do while loops. And I'm going to go into the differences between these 3. Just keep in mind that generally they're pretty similar, and you don't have to use any one particular type of loop to accomplish a task. There's always going to be alternatives for things that you can do to accomplish the same things using different loops. So we'll start with the while loop. This is probably the simplest loop to understand. Basically what happens is that in the loop, the first thing that will happen is that the program will check to see if your condition is true. And if you forget about what conditions are, basically a condition is just a check to see whether something is true or false. And so you can say in this screenshot example that we have right here, we are doing a check to see if counter is less than 3. You could have another check, which is counter greater than 3. You can check to see if counter equals 3, or maybe counter is true. If counter was a true or false value rather than a number, you could check those different things. So the condition here, it's going to be either true or false, and if the condition is true, then all of the code inside the block gets executed. And once the code inside the block gets executed, the program will check to see, is the condition still true? And if it is still true, it runs the code inside the block again. And then it'll keep doing that until the condition is no longer true. As soon as the condition is false, then it stops executing the code inside the loop, and then it moves on to the next thing. And so it's possible to get what is called an infinite loop. Basically, if the code inside your loop never actually changes the conditions of the check at the top, it will continue running infinitely, right? In this specific example, I'm going to run through it, and you're going to see how the contents of the loop actually changes the conditions. And so line number 1 here, you can see that we have a counter, and this counter is set to a value of 0. That's the very first thing that happens. And then we move on to the top of the loop here, and you can see that it's checking to see, is counter less than 3? Now we've just set it to 0, so in this point in time, the counter is less than 3, which means what we're going to do is we're going to go into line number 4, and we're going to do a console.log. Now console.log is going to take the contents of counter and print it to the screen. And that's what you're seeing over here on the left side with the output. That's the 0. So counter is 0. We print out 0 to the terminal. And now we move on to line number 5, which is counter plus equals 1. So we're increasing the counter by 1. And now on the left side, we see that after is now 1 highlighted in yellow. We went from 0 to 1, counter has been increased. And so when we go back and we check, is this condition still true? Is counter still less than 3? It is. It's no longer 0, it's now 1, but 0 and 1 are both less than 3. So the condition is still true, which means we go through the code again. And we check here, and in this case, we print it out. We print out the counter. The counter is 1, and so you can see on the left the output is 1. And now we also increase the counter again by 1. And counter goes from 1 to 2. Now we're back at the top of the loop, and we check to see, is counter still less than 3? It's no longer 0, it's no longer 1, it's now 2, but 2 is still less than 3. And so the condition is true, which means we go inside the block, inside those 2 curly brackets, right? We now print out the counter. The value of counter is 2, so that's what we print out on the output. You can see that printing out there. And now we increase counter by 1 again. Now counter is 3, highlighted in yellow on the left side. And we finally go and do another check, and we see, hey, is counter still less than 3? Now 3 is not less than 3. 3 is equal to 3, which means that the condition is no longer true. And we terminate the program. Now, we terminate the loop. It just so happens that this is the end of the program, so the program also terminates. But if there was stuff that happened after the loop, that code would then get executed. But what we're able to see here is an example where we repeatedly perform this task. This task is printing out the value of the counter and increasing the value of the counter by 1. If we never increased the value of the counter by 1, then counter would always be less than 3, which means that this loop would keep going infinitely. This is what's called an infinite loop. And so that's why it's very important when you write loops to be very careful that you are always making sure that in the process of iterating through your loop, the condition can change, because if it does not change, this will go on infinitely and it will basically cause your program to get stuck. It would keep printing out, it would just keep printing out this console.log infinitely, and it will never terminate. It'll just keep going that until you kill the program. And so when you're writing loops, be very sure that you're making sure that the condition the condition will yield a different result when the loop iterates. In this circumstance, because we're changing the value of counter, and at some point the value of counter will no longer be less than 3, we know that this loop will end at some point. So just be very aware of that when you're writing your loops. Now let's move on to a different type of loop. We're going to move on to the for loop. For loops are very, very similar to while loops, but they also allow a command to be executed one time when the for loop starts. And this is before the condition is checked. And this allows and it also allows the command to be executed at the end of every iteration. So when we get to the end of the code block, we're going to execute a command. And you can see here, I wrote these two equivalent examples. On the left side is the example that we just walked through with the while loop. And on the right side, this is the same exact thing, but written as a for loop. And what you can see here is that we took the condition in we took the statement in line 1, let counter equal 0, and we add this to the beginning of the for loop. So on the left side, we use the while keyword. On the right side, we use the for keyword. And what you have is the ability to say, this is the command to execute at the very beginning one time. Then you have a semicolon, and then you have your condition. This is the same condition that we had with the while loop on the left. And then we have another semicolon. And then we have the command to execute at the end of every iteration. So every time we get to the end of the code block, we're going to execute this command, and that command is counter plus equals 1. And so you can see how these two things are equivalent. On the left side, outside of the loop, we set counter equal to 0. On the right side, it's in the for loop, but it's at the very beginning, right? That's the first thing that the for loop will do, and that only executes once. It's not going to execute every single time you go through the loop. On the left side, in the body, in the code block inside the while loop, we create the statement counter plus equals 1. So it's the contents inside the while loop that actually increment the counter, which will eventually make it so that counter is no longer less than 3, which will get us outside of the loop. On the right side, after our condition, counter is less than 3, we have counter plus equals 1. And that plus equals 1 will always iterate at the end of every iteration of the for loop. And so when we enter the for loop, we print out the counter, and then we reach the end of the for loop, which means that we now do counter plus equals 1. We increment the counter by 1, and then we check the condition again. And so these two things are equivalent. They'll do the exact same thing. Now, there's also another type of loop called the do while loop. So these are also similar to while loops, but the difference is that no matter if the condition is true or not at the beginning, the code block, the contents, will always be executed once. They're typically uncommon. You don't see them very frequently, but I'm showing an example here on the right side, and the syntax is very different. So with the for loop and the while loop, you basically use the keyword. You say for or you say while, and then you have your condition. And in the case of the for loop, you have the initial statement, and then you have the code that runs every iteration. And then you have the curly brackets, and then you have the code block. It's actually reversed when you do a do while loop. So with a do while, you say do at the top, and then you have the code block, and then you have the while keyword, and then you have the condition. And this helps you visualize the fact that your code will get executed once, always, before the condition is even true, before the condition is even checked. And so that's why I have this does not equal with these two code snippets on the left and the right side. The substance of the left and the right side is exactly the same, except for the fact that we're using a do while loop on the right side. And because we're using a do while loop on the right side, the code for printing out the counter will get executed no matter what. And if you can see what we're doing in the previous example on the previous slide, we had counter starting at 0. Instead, we're saying counter is going to start at 3. And so on the left side, when you enter that while loop and it does the check, and it's going to ask, is counter less than 3? No, it's not less than 3. Counter is equal to 3. It's not less than 3, which means the left side, the substance of that code block, never gets executed. We never print out the value of counter. We never increment counter by 1. But on the right side, the contents of that the do while loop, that code block there, will get executed even before we check the condition. And so what will happen on the right side is line 4 will get executed. The counter will get printed out, the value of 3 will get printed out, and then we increment counter by 1. And so now counter is 4. And then we check the condition. And so it's going to check, is counter less than 3? Well, counter is 4, which is definitely not less than 3, which means that the do while loop will not repeat, but we have already executed the contents of this do while loop once before we've even checked the condition. So that's the big difference between the left side and the right side. On the left side, nothing is ever printed, but on the right side, the counter is printed once. So let's move on to we'll cover a little bit more about loops in the demo. But if you have any questions about any of this, ask it now in the chat, and I'll go through it again and answer your questions before we get into the demo. But I'm going to move on right now to libraries. And so that's our second topic for today. How do libraries work? And so let's dive into that. Now, libraries are basically just some other code that has been written that you can pull into your program, that you can use. It's written by someone else, or it could even be written by yourself, but you can incorporate that code into your project so you don't have to rewrite that code. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's a very bad idea to have duplicate code, because there's a chance that if you have the same code in multiple locations, if you want to change the logic, you might forget to update it one place or the other. Sometimes it's just a pain. Oftentimes it's a pain to rewrite the same code multiple times. And if someone has already written that code for you, wouldn't it be better to just use their code rather than rewriting your own code? This is how coding has become, and software has become so much more prolific over the years, is because people have written code and they've shared that code online over the internet. And you can utilize that code, whether it's you copy and pasting into your program. Maybe they publish their code as a library. That library can then be imported into your code, and or sometimes coding, some frameworks will include a lot of code to begin with, so you don't have to go and download it, import it you don't have to download it from the internet. You can just import it directly. And so I've kind of already alluded to this, but the process of incorporating someone else's code, incorporating a library into your own code, is called importing. And in Node.js, there is a special keyword that is used to do that. It's require. And so you call it like it's a function. But in this example here, what we're doing is we're creating a new variable called fs, and we're setting it equal to require fs. Now, fs is the file system library in Node.js. And this basically allows you to do all the input and output, which is what we're going to cover in the next section. But what's happening in this line is that it's taking all of the code in the fs library, and it's going to create a variable called fs, and we can access all of the code in fs from this variable. And so there are a lot of different functions inside the fs library, and we can call them by doing fs dot and then the name of the function. Now let me move on to the actual using of fs, because this will make a little bit more sense. And so we're going to input output processing, and I mentioned this, the fs package has the functionality that lets you do input and output. Specifically, what we're interested in today is the ability to read and write to files. And there are two specific functions that we're interested in. There's a lot more than two in the fs package, but if you go to that URL, or you can just Google Node.js fs documentation, you can look it up and you can see exactly what other functions there are in that package. But specifically with what we're doing here today, we are interested in the fs.readFileSync function. What that is going to do is it allows us to specify the file path of a file that we want to read, and it's going to just take the contents of that file and make that text, make that a string that we can access in our code. And in the second function here, we've got fs.writeFileSync. So we have read file sync and we have write file sync. I think the name is pretty self-explanatory. Unlike the previous one, this allows you to save the contents of some text that you have into a file. Now, the first one, you have to input the path to the file that you want to read. The second one requires the path to the file that you want to write, and it also requires the actual data that you want to write. I think that also makes sense, right? If you want to write something to the file, you need to say which file you're writing to, and you need to say what you're writing to that file. So those are the two components. So let's go into an example. I've got some code here, and we're going to step through this one at a time. And so this very first line, you've seen this already. This is us requiring FS. This is importing that code into our code. And the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to create a variable called text. And we're going to set it equal to the value of fs.readFileSync. And in this case, we're going to have a file called input.txt. And we're going to take all of the contents of input.txt and we're going to save it into our variable called text. Now, in this example, I'm actually going to have this be empty. And so when we finish reading it, it's just when we finish reading that file, by default, it's going to be blank. And we're going to add stuff to that text and then save it again. So on line number 5, we have a for loop. And this for loop starts by creating a counter and it sets it to 0. And so you can see on the left side, we have counter, the value is equal to 0. And then we go on to the condition. The condition, it checks to see if counter is less than 3. This might seem a little bit familiar. In this case, yes, it is less than 3. And so now we move into the code block, the contents, the substance of the loop here. And on line 6, inside the for loop, we have text plus equals. And then what you're seeing here is just a space, like literally if you hit the space bar, plus the value of counter. Now, space makes sense. Counter, the value is currently 0. So what we're doing here is we are taking the current text variable and we're adding a space and we're adding a 0. And when we move on from here, we can see that the counter is, once we finish this line of code, we get to the end of the for loop, which means that we need to execute that counter plus equals 1. So we increment counter from 0 to 1, and now we check the condition again. The counter is 1. 1 is still less than 3, and so we move into the contents of the loop. We move into the loop, and again, we add a space, but instead of adding a 0, counter is now equal to 1, which means we add a 1 to the text. And you can see here that we went from space 0 to space 0, space 1. We make it to the end of the loop now, which means we have to increment counter by 1 again. And so counter goes from 1 to 2. We finish the incrementing, we go back to the condition, counter is less than 3, counter is 2, 2 is less than 3, which means we move into the loop. We go into the loop, we add a space, and we add the value of counter, which is 2, and we add that to the text, and you can see it updated, space 0, space 1, space 2. We make it to the end of the loop now, which means we need to do the incrementing. So we increment counter by 1. Counter is now 3. We check the condition. 3 is equal to 3. 3 is not less than 3, which means we make it to the end of the loop and we continue. And now we get to line number 9, where we specifically save the contents of the text. We do the fs.writeFileSync. It's going to save text into this output.txt file. So in this example that we had today, input was blank. But if you had something inside that file, the effect would be that it'll take whatever is inside the file, and then it'll add space 0, space 1, space 2, and then it'll save it to another file called output.txt. This is a very simple task. It's not particularly useful, but you can see how you might be able to do something a little bit more interesting with this in the future, right? If you write some code, maybe what you could do is you could read numbers from input.txt, and then your loop can do math, right? Could add something to those numbers and then save that as an output. So you could write a program which, if every line inside input.txt is a number, you could write a loop that goes through every single line, takes the current line, and adds a number to that, and then saves it as an output file. So you could write a program that adds 1 to every value inside your file, your input file. And that's just an example. And if people are interested, we can do a lot more sophisticated stuff. I can dive into, actually writing some code that will actually help you kind of like parse through a log file. Being able to like do the loop, iterate through every single line inside a file and process that line to maybe do some like data crunching, right? That could be something that we do in a future episode. So the concept, though, that fundamental of like, how do we actually read a file? How do we do a task repeatedly? And how do we save something to a file? That's everything that we've just covered today. That's pretty valuable. And so let me just do a recap. So at this time, and well, I have my little disclaimer here. Everything will be in JavaScript. Yes, everything, not just from here on out, but everything prior is in JavaScript. But if you have any questions about any of this, please ask in the chat. I will answer all of those questions before we move on to the demo. So let me know if you've got any questions. But let me do a recap of what we covered today. So we learned that loops allow you to repeatedly execute a block of code based on a condition. That's pretty straightforward. We want to do this code multiple times. The most common loops are while loops and for loops. And for loops are like while loops, except they allow you to execute a command once, specifically one time, before checking the condition. And they allow you to execute a command at the end of every iteration of the loop, which is how we get that counter behavior. There's also do while loops. Those are pretty uncommon, and they will always execute the contents of a loop once before checking the condition. Now, if you're trying to distinguish between a for loop and a do while loop, let me make one thing very, very clear. So a for loop will allow you to specifically execute a code statement, which is defined inside the for loop, like the top of the for loop. A do while loop will execute all of the contents inside the loop before checking the condition. So what this means is that in the case of a for loop, it will not execute the contents, what's inside the two curly brackets of the for loop until it's checked the condition. You can execute a statement before you check the condition, but that statement is not the same as the contents of the for loop, what's inside the code block. With a do while loop, what's inside the code block will always get executed before you check the condition. So those are two different things. The for loop is saying you can have an extra statement that you want to execute before the for loop condition checks, before the for loop condition is checked. And then if the condition is true, then execute the body of the for loop. But with the do while loop, the body gets executed regardless of the condition. And so those are two different things. Just keep that in mind. If you start practicing with these two things, it'll make it a little bit more understandable. But with the for loop, you get to specify a statement that will get executed before you check the condition. And if the condition is true, then you execute the body. With the do while loop, you execute the body first, and then you check the condition. All right. And moving on to the recap, when you're using other people's code or even some of your own code that you might have written into in a different file, you're going to import that using the require keyword in Node.js. And with Node.js, you can also use the fs package to read and write files. It has some other functions in there that we didn't cover today, but all that functionality of reading, writing files, you need to import the fs package to go and do that. All right, so I'm going to take a second to see if there's any questions, and then I'm going to move on to our demo. All right, it doesn't look like there's any questions. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to ask. I'll cover it as we go through the demo. But let me just switch my screen now. And we've got our Kali machine here. So I'm logged in. On the left side, I've got a terminal. And on the right side, I've got a little code editor here. And so we're going to try actually writing some JavaScript. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by just going through that example that we did and trying to replicate it and actually see what happens when we run that code. So let me make sure I've got my environment set up here. Okay, great. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to import the fs module. And so I'm doing const fs. This is declaring a new variable, calling it fs, and we are importing the fs module. And then we are going to read the contents of that file. So fs.read file sync input.txt is the file that we're going to read. And then we're going to create our loop for let counter equals 0, counter is less than 3, counter is incremented by 1 every single iteration. Those are my curly brackets, which are going to denote the contents of my for loop. And then I've got my text here, and I'm going to do plus equals. Plus equals means we're going to add to it. We're going to add a space, and we're going to add the value of counter, the value of counter here. And then at the end of this, we're going to save the contents to output.txt. And this is the text. So I'm hitting save. I'm saving this. On my left side here, I've got my terminal. And you can see I've got my program.js. So actually, let me print out my program.js so you can see this is the code that we wrote. All right. What we need to do now is we actually need to create this input.txt file so that we can actually read it in. So I'm going to do touch input.txt. So we have now a blank input.txt file. And if I do ls, you can see there's the input.txt. If I run node my program, what should happen is we will read input.txt. We have this loop, which will add some spaces and you'll add the value of counter. And then it will do that 3 times. It'll do it with counter 0, counter 1, and counter 2. And then it will save the contents to output.txt. So let's try this out right now. I'm going to hit enter. The program executed. I'm going to do an ls. You can see now that there's an output.txt file. And if I print out output.txt, you can see space, here's the space, 0, space 1, space 2. Now, what happens if we had actually put in something inside input.txt? Let me just say hello world, like this. If I run the program again, and then we print out output.txt again, you can see there's the hello world, and then the 0, 1, 2. So We are actually able to like edit a file and then save it. If we wanted to, I think we could even, I don't know, I hope this won't generate an error. But what this is going to do is it's going to save it back into the original. All right, it looks like that worked. Let me print it out. Okay, so there's input.txt. Let's try this again. All right, so every time I run it, it's adding more 0, 1, 2 every single time. More 0, 1, and 2. And so right now, if you wanted to basically write a program and go through a file and make some modifications, you actually have the makings of doing that. There are some additional functions that might be interesting to learn to help you do that. And I can actually go through in today's demo and actually show you some more interesting things that you can do with this. So what I'm going to do is I am going to call another function. Now, we can have another episode to go more into how some of this stuff works, but I want to just briefly show you what's possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this function called split on the file that we read. And what the split function does is it will take the text and every single character that it sees that you provide, it will use that as a delimiter to split your text into a list. And and in this case, what I'm doing is I'm actually providing in the special character /n. /n is called a carriage return, and it basically represents, or sorry, it's not a carriage return. It's the new line character. And basically, every single time you hit enter and move on to the new line, it's a hidden character that you don't actually see, which indicates that we've moved on to the new line. And so what I'm doing here is I'm splitting my input.txt file, and every single time there is a new line, I am creating some new I am creating a new item, and I'm putting this all into a list. The idea here is that if I want to do something to every single line in this file, I want to treat every single line independent of each other. Because what we did in our original example is we took all of the text in the file and then we just added text to the end of the end of the file. But what if we want to do something to every single line in the file? We want to split that file into individual lines and then modify each line one at a time. And so what I'm doing here is I am saying every single line, split that into its own element. And then I'm going to rename this. Instead of calling it text, I'm going to call it lines. And then we have our counter here. And so what we're going to do is, what I'm going to do is I'm going to check to see if counter is less than the lines.length. This is going to be the number of lines that we have in our list. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that we're going to take lines, and you can actually reference. So what we did is we have this file, and we're creating a list of lines. How do we access each specific line within that list? You could do it by an ID, and the IDs start at 0. And so ID 0 is going to refer to the first line, ID 1 is going to refer to the second line, and so forth. And so what we can do here is we can use the counter as a way to reference the specific ID of the line that we want to modify. And then what we can do is we can say, we want to add something to the end of each line. And so we're going to add a space, and what we're going to do is we're going to add the counter. Very similar to what we did before, but instead of adding the counter, all of these counters to the end of the file, we're going to add it to the end of each line. And then instead of saving text, because text no longer exists, we're going to save lines. And so now I'm going to run this program and I'm going to pray that I didn't do anything wrong. And of course I did something wrong. Okay. Let me see if this solves my problem. Cool. Okay. So I specifically needed to save the contents of the text as a string. That's what I did here. But that program ran. So let me actually give it something interesting to put inside input.txt now. So we're going to have line. This is a line. This is another line. This is the last line. So this is the contents of our input. What we are expecting is that on line 1, on this first line, it will print out a space. It'll save a space and the value of counter, which is 0. And then on the second line, it's going to add a space and the value of counter, which is going to be 1. And then on this third line, it's going to add a space and the value of counter, which is going to be 2. So if I actually run this now, fingers crossed that this is as we expect it. All right, it looks like, all right, interesting. So what it did was it added the 0 and the 1 and the 2, but it didn't save it back as separate lines. So let me fix that. There's something I need to do. Basically what happens is when we tried to save our list to the file, Node.js has basically a list of these 3 different lines, but it doesn't know how we want to reassemble these 3 lines. Do we actually want to put them on different lines? It defaulted to this behavior where it comma separated them and put them all on one line. Because once we split the lines into this list, it doesn't know that these should be on different lines. It just sees them as three snippets of text. It doesn't know that they're specifically lines. And so we need to go back and say, and add the new line character back in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in .join. And what .join is going to do is it's going to take every single text snippet that we have, every single line, and it's going to add back in the special new line character. And this is going to allow us to basically reassemble the file with the new line characters in here so that we see all of these text snippets on separate lines. And so we can run this again. And if we print out the file, we can see here, here's line 0, here's line 1, here's line 2. Now, as it turns out, at the end of the file, there was a new line which we didn't see, which created a new final line here. Or actually, I might be confusing myself here. No, that's what happened. There's a hidden new line character at the end of the file, and so what happens is it was blank, and then we added a space and a 3, and so that we now have this extra line in here. But you can imagine how this might be useful, right? If you at some point want to be able to maybe you want to like combine 2 files together. You could take lines from one file, lines from another file, and add them together into one super line and stitch that all together so that you've basically just like taken all the lines from file 1 and all the lines from file 2, combine them together. And that might be something that's helpful for you as you're like analyzing data, right? If you're analyzing log files, maybe that's something that's useful. You could do something more sophisticated, like doing some math calculations that I mentioned. But what's really interesting here is that you can basically write a program, and whatever calculations or whatever work you want it to do, you can save the contents to a file now. So that's a pretty good skill set to have. And I think that's a pretty good point to end today's episode. And so hopefully you all found that useful. If you have any questions about this, I didn't see any questions come up today, but if you have any questions, now is a great time to ask. I'm going to put up a poll because I'd love to know what you all want us to cover in the future. I know today we're getting into December. We're getting close to Christmas, so people are kind of out. And today's actually going to be our last episode for the year. And if you've got any ideas for what topics you want us to cover, please let us know. We're going to come back again in January, start covering some new topics. And we've got the poll up right now for you to vote. If there's something you want us to cover that isn't in the poll, please let us know in the chat. And these episodes are specifically to help you all learn about cybersecurity. We want to be here and helpful for you. If you aren't already aware, the spring season of the National Cyber League, the registration is going to open on January 31st. And so hope you all enjoy your break. It's not too long until the next season, but we're here to help you prepare. And so if there was something that you struggled on in this season of the National Cyber League, let us know in the chat, let us know in the poll. We'll start covering some of those topics to help you out and prepare you for the spring season. So I'd like to thank you all for your time today. Thanks for joining us. Hopefully you've learned something new. If not, let us know what you want to learn, and we'll cover those in future episodes. But enjoy the rest of your year here, since we're in December, and we'll see you in 2022. So take care, and thanks for joining us once again.